Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today I want to do something a little bit different. You see, I talk a lot about the races and how they used to act on the tabletop, and what I want to do now is kind of expand on the tabletop aspect of things, mostly for two specific reasons. One, there are very heavy rumors regarding Warhammer the Old World and when it will appear and so on, and I want to talk about the glory days of Warhammer Fantasy, more specifically for 8th edition, in the form of a tier list, so you can see more or less how each race and faction kind of acted, which is going to be very interesting to some, I imagine, as some of the races in Total War Warhammer are very different to how they actually acted on the tabletop. So without further ado, let's begin. So as you can see, I've got all the races and factions listed below, primarily 8th edition. Some armies unfortunately did not have an 8th edition book and instead stayed with 7th or 6th. I'm not going to go to any other previous editions like 5th downwards because, well, when you compare them, they're just radically different or they're just not going to have a good time. And the idea is to rank the army books just as a normal tier list, but it's going to be based on a few different things. How they play for fluff reasons, these are more friendly games, how they play for competitive, and finally how they play in fun terms. I played all three, but I was mostly more on the competitive and fun roster because it was just cool to be able to use different armies around. You'll also notice that the Tamilkhan supplement is here, and that's mainly because I'm going to be using it for the Chaos Dwarfs as that was the last army release they ever had. I'm not going to reference the supplement itself or any other supplement because it only added to change the game a little bit to add different modes and all that. We'll start off with the Empire, as the Empire was considered the starter faction for most people. They were the most streamlined in terms of rules, and they were generally quite powerful when it came to competitive play. The Empire has a very decently sized roster, mostly focusing around loads of different troop choices, so different weapon choices for all your state troops, loads of different types of artillery, loads of different types of magic too. You were very well rounded as a faction, which really meant that the Empire was one of the most versatile, as you could tailor your army to however you wished. If you wanted to go gun heavy, you could. If you wanted to have a mixed roster, you could. You wanted to go cav heavy, you could. The great thing about the Empire was the fact that you could just do whatever you wanted. So in terms of fun factor, it was pretty high because you could theme your armies however you wanted and you could just play around. Experimentation meant that the Empire was the go-to faction for a lot of people, and yeah, I can see that happening. I've got an Empire list myself which is mostly focused around gunpowder, but I do have a cav heavy list too, which is so good mainly because the cavalry has got a 1-up armor save, so they were pretty disgusting. For fluff games, again, the variety helped you a lot, so you didn't really feel like your army wasn't going to change much, and you could easily just swap out stuff and it would still be a decent army. Swapping out some units in most cases would have been a bit of an issue, especially for other factions, but the Empire didn't really have anything of those issues. Now when it came to competitive play, the options also came into effect, as you could tailor to actually counter pretty much what you were fighting against. This is if your tournament allowed you to swap. If you didn't, you could still make a fairly decent well-rounded list which could be tailored to fight pretty much anything. Again, from powerful Empire gun lines to an immovable object like the steam tank, you were pretty geared for practically anything. The Empire book still stands as one of the best that were available. One problem is obviously the fact that there were so many different options, however, that it was a fairly expensive army. But if you were going in with the Empire, you were mostly going all in, so you were prepared to spend the cash. Obviously back then we also had some pretty good boxes available with the battalions and the army boxes, which did make it a lot easier on the wallet, and I must say that those boxes still stand as some of the best that were ever released by Games Workshop because they actually had useful stuff. Ranking wise, I'm going to have to put the Empire on A tier. They are one of the best out there, and they're just really fun to use. Yes, the Empire did have some issues, but the majority of the book itself was focused on quite a good power play and having so much variety, so you as a player were open to so many different styles that you wouldn't really notice the issues too much. It's an army book that I'm very fond of and I keep going back to quite often, especially when just making new lists for fun. When I'm playing fluffy games, I'll generally try to play an Empire roster because I can just play around and try out different loadouts. Even many years later, I still have to discover quite a lot with this book, and it's just really fun to use. Next, we're going to look towards the dwarfs, another popular race, and very, very different, mainly because, well, lack of magic. Here, you're focusing mostly on gunpowder, heavy armor, a lot of heavy armor, loads of artillery, and not only that, but you're quite good at dispelling magic, with a lot of your units also having a natural ward save due to magical resistance. The playstyle for the dwarfs is quite slow, as you're mostly going to focus on turtling, building up a wall of immovable warriors with very, very high leadership, as dwarfs are quite difficult to break. You'll also have some heavily armored gunsmen like thunderers being able to hit your enemy quite hard from afar, and then a lot of different artillery. You've got so many different options here that your artillery is built to take on pretty much any different type of enemy. The big clutch is that you don't have access to any magic, which is a bit of an issue considering that magic is so powerful in the Warhammer series, but you do have a natural resistance to it, which does help out quite a lot. You will notice the lack of magic, but it won't be that noticeable. Now, it's not too much of an issue, especially if you're looking at friendly or fluffy games, as those are more based on you being the strongest. You are literally going to be the strongest here, because anything that you have is quite powerful. Your troops themselves are quite good. The fact is, you kind of want your enemies to charge you too, because you're actually quite good for those shield saves. So you can pretty much deploy and wait for your enemy to come to you whilst you shoot them from afar. It's a fun army to play if you don't want to think too much, and some people just like that too. Now, when it comes to competitive play, again, the clutch of not having magic is quite noticeable, even with the resistance. You can shut down magic with runes, and the rune system itself is extremely varied because you can build your runes. If you're coming from a Total War Warhammer perspective, we don't even have that just yet. This is more on lines of picking different options and creating a completely unique rune for your characters, so you can gear your characters to be, well, as powerful or as anti-spells as you need. I've seen two different types of lists, mostly for the dwarves, where it either focuses very heavily on a defensive line with loads of guns, or there is quite an aggressive one with scouts, where you can be quite aggressive and just move up forward. It depends on how that plays and what you're playing against, but either way, you do have options, and it does work out quite well, though mostly you're going to be shooting from afar. From a ranking sense, I'm going to have to put them in B tier. Now, B tier is still a very good rating. I'm not sure how people see this, but I see S as like one of the best, A is really good, B as good, C as it needs a lot of help, and D, why are you even playing this type of thing. So it's still a good ranking, and the dwarfs themselves are very fun to use, especially when you don't want to think too heavily and you just want to turtle. The turtling can be cool for fluffy games. It works well for competitive. My only real issue is that the gameplay is very slow, so either way, you do feel like the game is lasting a lot longer. There's not a high price of entry for the dwarfs too, so you get to have quite a lot of fun, as you're going to be mostly with smaller armies. And yeah, you do have a lot of different options for artillery and so on, and even some stuff like flying units, but in most cases, you're not going to be spending too much money on the dwarfs. So now we're going to look towards the Ogre Kingdoms, and a lot of people might be surprised by my ranking for this. So the Ogre Kingdoms themselves, in theory, should be one of the worst army books. They use a lot of big monsters, and the thing is that monsters themselves aren't in the best place. Especially for 8th edition, they were probably one of the worst things to use in your roster. Monsters could easily be sniped out, and yeah, you would feel it very, very quick. However, with the ogres, you could focus mostly on not using monsters, and you could use, say for example, just ogres, and what you could have is a terrifying bus of flesh being thrown at you and just smashing your lines without too much of an issue. They were paired with a lot of heavy attacks, a lot of strong attacks too, and you could have a lot of fun with it. When it comes to fluffy and friendly games, you had variety, and that variety itself was focused mostly on doing damage, whether this was range or whether this was in melee. Variety wise, you didn't have a lot. I'd say that the Ogre Kingdoms might have one of the smallest army books in terms of possible units, but you did have the power behind it. Lead belchers were always terrifying on the tabletop, and I was always kind of scared to deal with them. Basic ogre balls and iron guts were just terrifying up front, and they could do a lot of damage. You had some fun cavalry with the Mournfang, and you had some pretty good artillery with the Iron Blaster. The Iron Blaster still stands as one of the best artillery pieces in all of Warhammer Fantasy. When it came to competitive play, you had a few options, but mostly it was what was called an ogre bus, where you had a bunch of characters together being protected by either iron guards or maybe just ogre balls, and they would just smash apart anything that was coming in front of them, especially if you got yourself an ogre charge, and the more ranks that you had behind them, the stronger the charge was. Ogres were also surprisingly fast, having a decent movement, so you could get up front to your enemy as fast as possible, and your enemy would feel it. Even some heavily armored knights would feel the ogre charge. From my experience, this is an army I thought I would absolutely hate, but yeah, I actually really enjoyed it. I honestly really enjoyed playing as the ogres. It was different to use a smaller army, as the army itself wouldn't be the typical 8th edition standard where you'd have like 100 miniatures or 150 miniatures depending who you played. This was just one of those armies that you could just not spend that much money, which, as you can imagine how I said it, is very strange, especially for Warhammer Fantasy, where everything was pretty costly to get into. Ranking wise, I've got to put them on S, funny enough, because they were strong, they were mobile, you were able to have a bit of variety, you had your own unique laws of magic too. The fact is that the ogres were just very playable, which is very strange when it comes to an army which should in theory be one of the worst. But I must say, using the ogres is always very fun, and fighting the ogres in any style of play is always going to prove that you're going to need to think ahead. It's going to be quite a hectic fight, and it's just going to be quite interesting overall. Funny enough, it's also the race that I introduced my friend to when he was just starting with Warhammer Fantasy, and it was easy enough to teach the game to due to the fact that it was just so simple, which I think is something that needs to be done in future army books when it comes to the Old World's release in the future, as it was just so easy to learn. Now we move on to Fair Bretonnia. Keep in mind that they have a 6th edition army book because Games Workshop never updated their stuff, and they did suffer a lot for it. Now, Bretonnia itself, as we know, is an army of knights and peasantry. You have very heavily armored knights, you have loads of different options when it comes to them, but in fact, the army was just kind of small. You didn't really have as many options as, well, pretty much anyone else, and that kind of shows for it when you are stuck with the same thing over and over again. When it comes to friendly and fluffy games, it's fine because Bretonnia itself is more for a friendly gameplay than anything else. You do have some heavily armored knights, and there's a bit of variety to them, though mostly they'll be using the same things. Unfortunately, their armor save was mostly 2+, which, yes, is very good, but you'd expect that they would have a 1+ just to make them a lot stronger, especially since you're not going to be fielding big armies. If you're going for a knight build, you're actually going to be fielding very small amounts of stuff. When it came to competitive play, Bretonnia did kind of suffer depending on what you used. You could go for a full peasant stack, which worked out quite well, as that was probably the most durable way to go, or you could go for full knights, you could go for a mix. Mostly peasants would work out quite well. It very much depended on your style of play, but you did suffer for it. You honestly did suffer. Bretonnia was in a bit of a weird place, which is a shame because the models actually aged extremely well for what they were. Some of the older miniatures still look good to this day when compared to some newer stuff, but they just were easy to counter. Now, they did have interesting formations and so on. That was something that was lost in newer editions, where you could have them in ranks of 3 instead of ranks of 5 upwards to get your bonuses, and those formations were very beneficial to you for charging benefits because you would get all your knights, well, most of your knights being able to do some damage, so you were quite aggressive, but it was easy to tell. The moment you started dealing with stuff which had some armor-piercing range, you would start dropping like flies. Now, Bretonnia did have something that a lot of people didn't, which was a natural ward save to their best units, which is their knights. But you had to pray for that, meaning that you had to skip the turn at the very beginning, so your enemy would go first. So even if you won the roll, you wanted your enemies to go first. And it was thematic, because, you know, praying and Bretonians and so on. But, you know, at that point, that means that you'll have to take a little longer to get to your enemy. They could shoot at you, especially if you were playing against dwarfs or empire. You would start to feel it quite heavily. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to put them on C tier, mostly because the lack of update shows. They fell behind when it came to all the other races. Even those that were in 7th edition were in a bit of a better place, and yeah, it's just not a great thing. It's a massive shame because the army itself is visually stunning and you could play around with them. You could have the RAF option with all the Pegasus Knights and all that. Hopefully they'll be better for Old World, as, I don't know, just Bretonnia didn't really have that much of a competitive edge. And even for fluffy games, like I said, they did suffer quite a bit. The issue mainly stands on just lack of updates. This was a big thing, and this was a massive issue when it came to Warhammer Fantasy in general, or even better yet said, just Warhammer in general, any setting. But Bretonnia, you could easily see, had a lot of issues. Next, we're going to look towards the Skaven. Now, a lot of people who know this channel know that I play Skaven a lot. I say it a lot when it comes to my videos, because the Skaven were just a faction that I just really enjoyed. They were very, very fun, hyper competitive, and just very fluffy too. The fact is that you could cheese these armies quite heavily. But before we get into the specifics of that, we have to talk about the cost. So the Skaven themselves are expensive, and I'm not kidding here. You're paying for a lot of miniatures because you have to field a lot of miniatures. It's one of the biggest armies that you need to field, more or less around 100 to 150 models depending on what you use. Even with the prices back then, it was still very, very pricey, as you needed to field armies and armies and armies and armies of it. Obviously the battalion boxes did help too, but it was still very, very expensive. But when it comes to gameplay, you can theme your armies quite heavily. This is in a friendly and narrative point of view, as, well, you know, there are major Skaven clans, and you could kind of tailor your armies to be focused around those clans, even the minor ones too if you're into the lore. You would literally have no problem theming it. If you wanted to theme on monsters, you could. If you wanted to theme on plague, you could. If you wanted to theme on artillery pieces and weapons themes, you could. It was done very, very well. It's a 7th edition army book, as you can see from the artwork, but it aged extremely well. When it comes to competitive play, the Skaven were quite competitive, having 2 unique laws of magic only available to them, the Law of Ruin and the Law of Plagues, with the Law of Plagues being very, very destructive. The thing is with the Skaven, however, is that you needed to be careful when you played these games. If you're going in for friendly and narrative games, that was fine, as a lot of your stuff did blow up. Like, seriously, a lot of your stuff blew up. Miscasts were very common. However, if you did want to play in a competitive sense, some magic and obviously going in a very horde function was probably the best. 8th edition was very kind to that because you had Steadfast, which really did give you the benefit of that. And if you could plan out how to deploy your stuff, well, you were in a very good place, as pretty much you could have clan rats with leadership 10 re-rolling all their leadership, which is fantastic, especially if you could just bog down your enemy and just wear them out because you have impressive numbers. I used to field 3 blocks of 50 clan rats, and it was very, very obvious that you could do a lot of damage with that. You could kit out your characters to be quite offensive or just very good at magic, and generally, the Skaven were just very good to play and will always be one of the best. For that, I'm putting the Skaven on A tier because they're just generally fun. Whether this is competitive or just fluffy games, you could have so many options. The price is a bit of a clutch, but if you're going in with a Skaven, you know that you've got to spend money. Unfortunately, it's just one of those things. Most cases, you're not going in to win, but you're going in for a more fun factor. You're going in there just to have a lot of fun and see what random things happen, because believe me, it's going to happen a lot. Whether it's your Doom Wheel charging into your own units, or shooting at your own units, or your Rattling Guns turning around and shooting down your own character. However, if you're going for a competitive play, you won't be using them, you'll just be going with a full terrifying horde, and stopping even Chaos Warriors from moving forward. Next, we're going to look towards the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves themselves were quite fun, as they had pretty good range, but it wasn't range focused. It was more the fact that you had a lot of armor piercing. Your crossbows essentially were guns. You had a decent amount of armor in your front line, and most of it was kitted out to doing damage, either in the form of armor piercing or just extra attacks. So you had a pretty good front line too. You had a good amount of skirmishing cavalry, magic was quite fun, and you pretty much had a few different types of ways to play them. Now, in fluffy and friendly games, you played the militaristic Dark Elf in most cases. You would see quite a decent amount of large monsters too, with like the Hydra, the Carabus, and so on. But in most cases, you had a lot of Dark Elves, you had a lot of shooting, you had a moving legion in a sense, which was pretty fun, as the Dark Elves were just pretty good at it too. Uses of assassins would come into play, where you could take out characters in a challenge, so everything was just generally quite good. When it came to competitive play, you had one of the best skirmishers ever with the Dark Riders. Believe it or not, Dark Riders were one of the top tier units, so if you're coming from a Total War perspective, you might be really surprised about that. But a feigning build, as they were called, were just really, really good, and yeah, you could see it. You could see the absolute disgustingness of the Dark Elves just very early on. The fact is that you also had a pretty good amount of range. You had spellcasters, which were highly mobile too, with the Doom Warlocks and all that. The Dark Elves were in a very, very good place. I'm going to have to put the Dark Elves on B tier, however, as they are very enjoyable. It's still very good ranking, and it's nothing against the race. They did lack from a few other possibilities, especially when you compare them to the High Elves, which we'll compare them soon. But in general, they were just pretty fun to use, and I think that the Dark Elf meta was just very good for competitive play. A tad broken, I must say. Like, the feigning cavalry stuff was very, very obvious, and it was very obvious to the Dark Elves. It became kind of tedious. You knew how to counter it, it's just you couldn't build to counter that, and also have that same list being able to counter everything else. Fun factor alone, they would be a lot higher, but it's just one of these things that balance comes into effect, and balance was kind of skewed. If we look towards the High Elves, well, the High Elves themselves are very much similar. Elves in general, well, Dark Elves and High Elves, would have very similar loadouts despite having very different units. Now, what made the High Elves so fun is that you had a lot of variety. You could easily theme your armies to be around any of the elven kingdoms of Ulthuan. You could have big monsters with, say for example, the Phoenixes, or you could focus very heavily on a build focusing on melee combat if you wanted to. Yes, the High Elves were okay with that. All elves in general are kind of squishy, which is why I put the Dark Elves a bit lower, because if they take a hit, they're going to die quite fast. Whereas the High Elves themselves were better to hold out, I think, and that's what made them a lot stronger. They also had some pretty cool stuff, like say for example the Lothan Sea Guard, which were a spear unit but also had bows. The ability to have hybrid units made them a lot stronger. You have some pretty good cav with heavy or light. You've got some pretty good magic options. The High Elves in general were just very, very well optimized, and it was very obvious when it came to fluffy or friendly games, and very, very obvious when you would play in competitive scenes too, as you were able to have a front line of Phoenix Guard which could hold down their own even against Chaos Warriors. Or like the Dark Elves, you could use a Feign list without too much of a problem, as you did have very, very fast cavalry that was able to do so. So you had quite a lot of options, and even then you were quite durable. So I must say that they were pretty fun to use. I still struggle sometimes when I'm playing against High Elves, but it's a fun game. It's not a frustrating game. When it comes to ranking, I'm going to have to put them in A tier because they were just really, really good. They had a lot of different options. You could play around with them. You didn't have to worry too much. You can obviously tell that some books were written better than others, and it really shows when it comes to 8th edition. There is a lot of overtuned books, but I would say that this one is in the very rare circumstance that it's powerful, but not stupidly overdone. Next, we're going to look at the lizardmen, and this is going to be quite interesting because the lizardmen are in a good place, but it mostly focused on either big monsters or big hordes. The thing is that in friendly and fluffy games, you had no problem. You could have fun. You had loads of different options. They had a very, very big list, because not only did you have big monsters, but you also had the Sauruses, then you also had the Skinks. So you could theme easily with no issue whatsoever. However, there is some issues, especially as your stuff is very slow, and I'm not just saying in movement, I'm saying also in combat. This more specifically goes to your Saurus, which for some reason are even slower than the dwarfs. Yeah, dwarfs would be hitting first. Some of you may not know this if you're coming from a Total War perspective, but initiative would decide who would strike first, and in most cases the Saurus will last, which kind of threw me off when I first saw that ages ago, because, you know, you're expecting alligator humanoids, you know, you're expecting them to be a bit stronger and all that type of stuff and faster, and yeah, it can be kind of obvious. Now, you can boost them up and make them quite strong, you can give them stupid amount of toughness too with spells, so you could make them fight faster too. But in most cases, you will notice that Sauruses will start to suffer. They are very durable, however, and they are able to bring out a lot of damage, so it very much depends on how your opponent rolls. In the competitive play, you could use a Feign list too with Skinks, and you did have access to pretty much like a lot of different things. So you did have the variety, though I never really saw the lizardmen doing too well, I must say, from every time I've played. And keep in mind that I've been playing for a long, long time. I always see the lizardmen kind of falling in most cases in ranking. So I'm going to put them in B tier when it comes to ranking. There's nothing really wrong with them, and they're very enjoyable to play. I think that they could be changed around a little bit when it comes to Old World, give them some more options to be able to attack faster. The Saurus do need to attack faster than dwarfs, I would say, because they're not as tanky as dwarfs, but they kind of are in a sense too. It's the bit of the weird thing when it comes to ranking these factions, but all in all, like I said, B is still a very, very good rank. Next is the Demons of Chaos, which essentially is 5 armies. You could either go full undivided and mix from all the different available options, or go full Khorne, go full Tzeentch, go full Nurgle, or even Slaanesh. It very much depends on your possible playstyle. So you had loads of different options there, and it made it very apparent. For friendly and fluffy games, well, again, you were fine. You could do whatever you wanted. You could just have a lot of fun and just theme your lists. So the possibility of going full monogod or going full undivided, it just really much depended on your possible playstyle, what seemed the most fun to you, and yeah, it was just really, really fun. I myself have fond memories playing with, say, for example, a full Slaanesh list, or even a full Khorne list. Those were pretty enjoyable to use. But even Undivided was just very fun because you felt like you were running demons and you could feel like you were running lore-friendly armies. Competitively, yeah, it was a bit the same, but it was also kind of different. You see, the demons themselves did lack because there was some stuff that could be done against them. There was loads of hard counters with certain different laws of magic, and in all honesty, they were pretty weak. You didn't have that many options, so Undivided was probably the best way to go when it came to that. Now, you did have a lot of Undivided stuff, and you could play a lot of different things. But building up competitive lists was always kind of strange, and there was always some other clutches with, say, for example, the Realm of Chaos table, which kind of worked against you sometimes and would screw you over. There were a lot of random elements too when it came to demons, like, for example, coming back at full strength, even if they've lost combat, or just completely disappearing, so that big block of 40 Plague Bearers just gone. It very much takes a gamble, and it's very similar to that of the Skaven. So when it comes to ranking, I would have to put them in B tier. They were very, very close to A, but if they would have had more options for the specific monogods to be able to give you some variety, even if that just meant some weapon options, then they would have been a lot higher, because I feel like if you want to play them in a good sense, you're kind of forced to play more Undivided to have different spell casting, different weapon types and all that. Even then, it's not really different weapon types, it's just different unit types. But say, for example, if we had the Bloodletters with halberds too, that would give them an anti-armor approach, and it would just be kind of cool to have a different choice. It's something that you notice is a bit of an issue when you just split them into 4 individual factions, and many people have been calling for proper monogod factions for a long, long time. Age of Sigmar finally made that possible, but it was a mix of demons and mortals, when where I really think is that the player base wants just more demon options, and it would be nice. It would be cool if we just had monogod lists. Even if we look towards Age of Sigmar and we look towards the end times where it was possible to mix up with Chaos Warriors, monogod lists were much more enjoyable, so I wouldn't be opposed to mortals, but it would be nice to finally have some more demons for the first time in 20 years, maybe? Yeah. Next is Orcs and Goblins, perhaps one of the largest possible army rosters in all of Warhammer Fantasy, mostly because you had a lot of options. You had Orcs, Savage Orcs, Goblins, Night Goblins, Forest Goblins. You had so many different things to play with, and you had loads of different weapon options because of that. For friendly and fluffy games, you could pretty much do anything, and it was always really fun to play with or against orcs, mainly because you never knew what was going to happen. The orcs themselves were so varied. You can deal with a heavy cavalist, you could deal with skirmishing lists, you could deal with loads of different fanatics all over the place. It was just really fun to see such varied stuff. I remember going to a tournament once where there were like 5 different orc players, and all of them had radically different lists, which was really fun. When it came to a competitive sense, yeah, again, you would have loads of different variety. There was a bit of a clutch though, because animosity was a rule that came in, which essentially meant your orcs and goblins would be fighting your own orcs and goblins. Yeah, it was a rule which a lot of people didn't like, and I guess it makes sense because it's a whole orcs and goblins thing, but you did notice it, especially when stuff didn't go your way. However, like I said, they're a generally fun faction to play and had loads of different options. I feel like they would be a lot better without animosity, maybe if it was done in a different sense, rather than your guys just charging against each other. But the options there made the faction very enjoyable. I myself was a big fan of the Savage Orc meme list, and it's something that I'm currently rebuilding and repainting myself. because, yeah, it was just fun to use. It wasn't going to be winning many games, but it was just something that you wanted there just for fun. I'd say when it comes to ranking, I'm going to have to put them on B tier. Animosity kind of screws them over in most cases, but other than that, they would be very high up. If anything, they'd be very close to A once again if they didn't have that, or if Animosity was worked in a different way. But all in all, it's a very enjoyable faction to play. I've had a lot of fun games with the Orcs and Goblins. I feel like they're just one of the most fun ones, purely because of the variety, and I think that they're one of the best armies done in a thematic sense, if you just want to have fun and just wow all over the place, which I think is what most Orc players want to do. Next is the Tomb Kings, and you see, the Tomb Kings have one of the best miniatures throughout the whole line. The Tomb Kings have all these big monsters, which, yeah, the big monsters aren't great because 8th edition was skewed against them, but they looked impressive. Like, visually, damn, the army is so cool. They also had interesting rules, and yeah, the army list was pretty good. It was varied, you had loads of different options, you had some pretty cool attacks, you also had range, so if you wanted to play an undead faction with range, this was the one for you. I'd say for friendly and fluffy games, Tomb Kings were great, and you could have so many options. Chariot meme stacks were great. You could have loads of archers, all shooting at a 5+ because of the arrow of the asps. You just had so many different things to be able to use that you could see yourself fielding different armies without too much of an issue. However, competitive play, whilst you could win because you had so many good things, you were kind of screwed in a little sense, mainly because you had that Hierophant rule where if your Hierophant died, you couldn't replace them like, say, the vampire counts could, and yeah, that's pretty much when you start losing. The problem is I've seen this happen constantly. Even, say, for example, turn 1, where your Hierophant would miscast and get swallowed by the warp, and there you go. You might as well just call it a day there, unless you were very, 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 very lucky. And I have to say very so much because, yeah, you had to be that lucky. Had that rule not been in existence, well, the things would have been a lot different for the Tomb Kings, and they would probably be an A-tier army. But they did suffer a lot for that, and it's a shame because they look so great. I myself have an army of about 5,000 points painted, and I still have a lot more to finish off. I love the Tomb Kings, I just don't want to use them because that just kind of kills it off. Even for friendly and fluffy games, yeah, I would like to play them, but that happening is just too much of a possibility. For that, I'm going to have to put them on C tier. If they would have just had that rule changed, a lot of things would have changed. The problem is, 8th edition did have its issues. Like, every edition has issues, but for some army which, you know, would have been so cool to see more often, as that rule did screw them over, despite the fact having one of the best looking ranges throughout the armies, it was just a massive shame, and hopefully they've learned for that. I mean, this is still Games Workshop. We're expecting them to be in Old World, but I do worry. I honestly do worry sometimes. Next, we're going to look over the Wood Elves, and the Wood Elves have changed over the years. By this point, they've lost their unique lore of magic, the lore of Athaloran, and instead used the lore of high magic and dark magic, which a lot of people wish that we'd go back to the old system as it made them much more unique. But when it comes to the Wood Elves, you technically have two different armies. Well, 3 really. You could either go for Wood Elf, so you'd be a typical elf, you could go for all Tree Spirits, or you could have a mix and match of both, which generally you would see armies being played in all the different styles. When it came to friendly and fluffy games, it was obvious that you could use anything and you could just play around. It was also quite interesting to see very overpowered lists too, because there was the possibility of increasing your toughness of your dryads to a massive level to make them extremely tanky. It very much depended. When it came to competitive style too, it was very much the same. Like, they were kind of well-rounded in all senses, and you could have skirmishing lists. You could even take out Skaven without too much of an issue with your war dancers, because you could negate their ranks, which I thought was fantastic. It very much depended what you wanted to do, but this is a typical example of a race that received a very good glow up despite having some stuff taken away from them. And I feel like the Wood Elves are probably one of the strongest books that I've seen for 8th edition, and it's one of those things that I'm impressed because I never expected them to be so good. I would suffer as a Skaven player versus them in tournament scenes or even friendly scenes too. So I kind of looked forward to playing against them because I wanted to see how I could do better to counter. When it comes to ranking, I'm going to put them in A tier because I feel like they were in a very good place and I just really enjoyed how the book ended up. They were strong, but they had variants. It would have been nice if some older stuff would have come back. I myself would have loved to see the Meadow Chariot return for the Wood Elf side of the book. And we know, for example, the stuff in lore that was mentioned, like, for example, Dryads with Bow, which would have been nice to just have a proper tree-based army and have some range to support. But all in all, I'd say that it was a fantastic book, really. It was just that good. It was one of the very last that were ever released. And this is at that point that power creep was available. So yeah, they were strong for a good reason. Next are the vampire counts. Now, the vampire counts have a great army book because the issue that the Tomb Kings had, which also the vampire counts had in earlier editions, is no longer there. So you could actually play them and not worry too much. Now, with the vampire counts, we had access to a lot of different units, whether these are zombies, skeletons, graveguard, even hex wraiths, something that's kind of new, and you had options. You could go with everything that caused fear, you could go with very fast moving units, very powerful stuff too. The fact is that you had so many different options. You could either go with a massive horde, loads of monsters, or just a bit of a mix of both. They were very versatile with their own lore of magic, and really the only thing they lacked was range. But out of everything, I'd say that they were very, very fun to use. In fluffy and friendly games, you could just play around. You could do a full necromancer stack. You could theme your armies to that of the other different types of vampiric bloodlines, which unfortunately that rule kind of got lost, and we never had that for 8th edition. Hopefully that returns in the future. But yeah, they were great. They were honestly great. Competitive-wise, you also had the edge there that you could keep in summoning units, so you could just pretty much overwhelm your enemy. But that became a bit of an issue too, because it was expensive. And I'm not saying Skaven expensive, it was worse than Skaven, because you needed to have a lot of extra models just to be able to summon in stuff if you wanted to. And to win as the vampire counts, you wanted to summon. You wanted to bring in as much as possible to fill out your ranks to make your 20 unit of zombies into a 50 unit of zombies by like turn 3, 4, depending on how well you rolled, of course. But you could easily have a lot of board control with this faction. Rank-wise, I'm going to have to put them on B tier, and they could have easily been A tier or even S tier due to the fact of their board control, but it's the case of it was just so expensive. They were more expensive than, say, for example, my Skaven. You needed to put a lot more money into this faction, and that was a clutch. For friendly and fluffy games, they would easily be an S tier because they had great board control and you could make unit fillers and so on. Some tournaments wouldn't allow for too many unit fillers and you needed unit fillers. This is where you made a bigger base and you kind of represented that as a number of zombies and so on if you summoned them in. But the fact is that they were more expensive than the Skaven, so a lot of people wouldn't be able to feel that much. Now, you didn't have to go with full hordes, but you did lose out on the board control, which kind of made it a bit of an issue. I must say that, yeah, they're a really fun faction to play. I really enjoy playing vampire counts. But ranking-wise, they fall down just because of the cost of entry. Next, we're going to look towards the Warriors of Chaos. Now, they had a rather large roster because, again, you could either go undivided, you could go mixed, you could go Khorne, you can go Sinesh. It very much depended on what you used, and you had a lot of really cool stuff. Skull Crushers were just incredibly powerful. The Hellstriders were incredibly fast. You had some devastating artillery with the Hell Cannons. The fact is that you had a lot of options, different weapon options too. They were a great book. It was a fantastic book. For friendly and fluff games, you could pretty much do whatever, and it shows. That's why they're one of the most kit-bashed armies, because people like to play around and make themes. I do that myself. I've got theme armies for all the different types of possible units. It's just fantastic to use. You've got options for loads of different unique laws of magic and some other ones. You've got some very strong frontline units with the Chaos Warriors themselves. And yeah, you could play around quite well. Competitively, this also showed one of the most terrifying lists I ever saw was a Tzeentch build, where you'd have Tzeentchian chariots, Tzeentchian footmen, Tzeentchian spellcasters with really high up armor saves and a very powerful ward save. They were just really, really good in general. Not only that, but I'd seen Khorne lists which are quite strong, Slaanesh lists which were built to take out even dwarf armor, and, well, even Nurgle lists which could just bog down anything and hold down ogre melee lines. Variety is definitely the spice of life here with this book, and it clearly shows. In terms of ranking, I'm going to have to put them in S tier. It's one of the best books I've ever seen. It was well powerful. It had some good variety. It had some good choices. It allowed players to experiment as much as possible. And it's just that good. It's honestly that good. It was a bit overtuned. Yeah, that's definitely for sure. But this is the case where Games Workshop released army books to be horrendously overpowered. We didn't get loads of FAQs here to bog them down like we do, say, for example, for 40k and even Age of Sigmar. But this was clearly just one of the best, especially just right from the launch. Next, we have the beastmen. Okay, so the beastmen themselves are pretty interesting because they've got really cool models. You've got big monsters like the Jabberslav, the Gorgon, the Cygor. All of these are really, really cool, and you had loads of different options. You had everything that was possibly available to you, a unique law of magic, all these different variants for your infantry, and you could do quite a lot of different things. When it came to, say, for example, friendly and fluffy games, you could have fun. You could play a horde of monsters, which, is what beastmen are all about. You could pretty much just move around and try and terror and fear your enemies into submission. When it came to competitive play, you could play with chariot builds, which were quite popular. You could use the Minotaur bus, which was very well known and could be very destructive. The only issue is, well, ambushing. Ambushing was just horrible when it came to the beastmen because they had a dedicated type of ambush which never got fixed until the end times. So yeah, the beastmen were kind of good at what they were intended to, but for like a month or two and then the world blew up. It was a big shame because the beastmen have always been kind of a bit of a joke in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And apparently there's still a bit of a joke in Age of Sigmar, which is a bit strange. But as you can tell, they only had a 7th edition army book, which is a massive shame because I feel like an 8th would have probably fixed that because a lot of people were very vocal about it. However, yeah, they just weren't great, and you wouldn't see them often. People would play them because, fun. And yeah, that's the best way to go about it. But even then, they did suffer, and they suffered a lot. When it comes to beastmen, I'm going to have to put them on D tier. It's sad, I know. It's a faction I very much admire, but they're just not in a very good place when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy. A lot of people still try to play them, and I do too, but it's very flawed. If the ambushes worked as intended, that doesn't mean to say that I don't play them. I do, and I think that they're quite fun. They've got some of the best looking monsters I've ever seen. Hopefully for Old World they'll be in a better place, and that's just my general thing. It's just the ranking purpose. They always come near last in most cases. And lastly is the Tamilkhan book, which we're not talking about Tamilkhan, we're talking about the Chaos Dwarves. You see, the Chaos Dwarves haven't been an army book since around, 4th, 5th edition, and they just kind of disappeared. Now, they came back when it came to Tamilkhan with a brand new army, loads of new miniatures, loads of really, really cool looking stuff, and a complete visual overhaul, some new stuff. It was just incredible to see. Now, they were a Forge World army, which means that they were kind of overpowered because Forge World. But either way, we had a new army, and this was the first time in a long time that we had something like this. Everyone was quite excited, and the Chaos Dwarves really showed off their power. In fact, I don't think that the Chaos Dwarves were fully completed too, as there were hints that we might have seen more in the other Throne of Chaos books, but they never happened. For fluffy and friendly games, I mean, is there a way to play them in a fluffy and friendly sense? They were very overtuned, their artillery was very overpowered, their monsters were quite strong. You could have a open army in a sense and just like mix and match, used a lot more hobgoblins, so it is possible. It's just it wasn't very seen much, plus getting your hands on Chaos Dwarves was easier than, for example, the hobgoblins. They were strong, and it really showed when it came to the competitive play, because Chaos Dwarves were very tanky. Keep in mind that they are dwarfs after all, so they would be very similar to that of the standard dwarfs, but they could easily move forward, and they had a lot of stuff that was able to move forward and fire, so they could do a lot of damage. They were able to just be up front without too much of an issue. When it comes to ranking, S tier is the obvious case because the models look great. You could play around with them in different ways. I have a few different Chaos Dwarf lists, and I've seen them do a lot of weird stuff. I've also been at the receiving end, which, yeah, I've seen how overpowered they are. But then again, this was a Chaos Dwarf army, and they were Forge World. I have to keep stressing that because Forge World is this different thing. And yeah, you can still beat them. I've beaten them before. There's loads of cases, like for example, going of anti-armor stuff, using some spells which affect armor. They are beatable, so they're not unbeatable. I don't think any faction here is completely unbeatable. They've all got their counters. So it's not like they were that broken, it's just you needed to think a bit more when you were building up a list to face the Chaos Dwarfs themselves. All in all, when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy, I'd say that all of the factions themselves have a lot of good points. They've also got their negatives too, but they were all pretty much playable, barring, say, for example, the Beastmen, which had quite a few issues, and the Tomb Kings. Those, at least in my perspective, are the ones that I actively avoided in competitive, but I would play them still in friendly games. It very much depends on the playstyle of the player too. Not all of these armies are meant for you. I've just played for a long time and I've been playing Warhammer Fantasy for a long time, so I've had armies built up over the years and I've been able to play with all of them. All the factions do have some issues, but I feel like in general 8th edition was in a good place. Well, yeah, the whole steadfast thing was just kind of annoying because it kind of made you focus more on hordes, but if you were playing to just have fun and so on, I think that it was a very good fun edition without going into the obvious meta and all that, and hopefully a spirit of that stays when it comes to Old World and fixes all the issues, of course, but we're going to have to wait and see when it comes to that. Now, the idea of this video was just to talk about this. Eventually, I do want to kind of do, say, for example, reviewing all the army books in detail and all that. I want to bring a lot more tabletop stuff to the channel, so I wonder what you guys think, and let me know in the comments below. So, yeah, we can have a little bit of a discussion and relive the glory days, which I think is always kind of fun. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Ogre for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.